Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, the AP and Procurement Linkage, Making the Perfect Online Match. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we move forward. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat box that you see on your WebEx window and I'll get back to you right away. If you face any issues with the audio, you can use the phone icon that you see on the screen and you'll receive the teleconference information. To ensure top quality, all your lines have been muted. If by chance you get disconnected during the webinar, you can use the details that you received in your initial confirmation email to log back in. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can use the chat box to type your question and hit send, and we'll take them towards the end of the webinar. The session today will be recorded and you'll receive the on-demand materials within 2 business days. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Richard Baugh. As Vice President for Corporate Development, Richard leads strategic initiatives in the area of new product introduction, market development, thought leadership, analyst relations, and strategic partner development programs. Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce. He helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. He was also co-founder of B2E Market, one of the first software-as-a-service sourcing suite providers, and later covered the supplier management market as an industry analyst for the Aberdeen Group. At this point, I'd like to hand things over to Richard to start with the topic.
Thank you, Sanjivani, and thanks everyone for joining our session today as we make the linkage, this connection between AP and procurement, and make that a perfect online match. And just before I get into the agenda for today, I'll tell you a little bit about Zycus. Zycus, in fact, is an end-to-end source-to-pay suite provider of an integrated suite of software tools across the source-to-pay process. We'll focus for the moment on the components that deal with AP automation within that full source-to-pay suite. So first, there's the supplier-facing components here, the Zycus Supplier Network. So through the Supplier Information Management Portal, suppliers are able to self-register or go through that onboarding process, load all their profile information. And that portal also gives them access to track the receipt and confirmation of purchase orders, to initiate electronic invoices, to be able on a self-service basis to monitor the status of their invoices as they go through the approval and payment process, which is a significant benefit to AP organizations because suppliers no longer have to call AP to ask about the status of their invoice and when they're going to get paid. On the buying organization side within the AP group, the AP Automation Suite really enables a touchless processing approach here. So automated matching, whether that's a 3-way match of the invoice to the PO and goods receipt, or maybe a 2-way match, as well as an automated workflow process to get those invoices approved and okayed to pay. And of course, lots of reporting and analytics throughout the invoice process as well as to pay process as well. And also giving the AP group tools to really drive the next level of savings opportunities through early pay and dynamic discounting capture. So that's a little bit about the AP Automation Suite and kind of how it works. Really, as I said, it starts on the supplier side with the self-service portal where suppliers can self-register, upload their profile of information, track and confirm the receipt of purchase orders, issue their invoices, and track their payment status as well. And all of this happens then in the cloud, but is integrated back to the ERP system. So being able to update the vendor master or supplier master in ERP being able to match those POs and invoices and goods receipts in the case of a three-way match, and ultimately complete the payment process back in the ERP system as well. So that's a little bit about the software, specifically around AP automation. And now we're going to dive into our agenda for today, which is, what is this linkage all about? How does the AP process fit into the procure-to-pay process so that we're linking AP and procurement together in an automated online match process, and take you through kind of a 5-step process here. And start with step number 1 is making sure that we've got that alignment between procurement and accounts payable, and then identifying or prioritizing what are our key goals and objectives, what are the success metrics, and how are those shared between AP and procurement. In any transformation process, it's important to first define and benchmark what the current state is. So we'll look at what some of the key metrics are for any organization to be able to look at their current process, identify where they rank sort of against some of the key metrics. How do I stack up against some of the best-in-class organizations, for example, to help identify where the current gaps may be and where I need to prioritize my focus in transforming those processes. And then in creating that blueprint, how do I go about designing both simplified and an optimal to-be process around the whole BiPay type relationship. And then ultimately in the 5th step here, how can I express this particular project in terms of a robust return on investment and business case justification to be able to get the project approved and budgeted and funded and those kinds of things. So 5 steps. We'll start off the first step, and to kind of set this up, I want to use Dilbert for each step, actually, because as we all know, there's nothing in the world of business that can't be explained by Dilbert. And on this subject of alignment, here's an example, a cautionary tale, if you will, I think, from the world of P2P. So here we've got Bob, the Director of Purchasing. A requester comes in and says, I requested an Ethernet switch and you sent me a box of pencils. Director of Purchasing says, well, sometimes I tweak the non-standard order so I can use our approved vendors. The requester clearly was not with whom the purchasing director was clearly not in alignment, says, well, you can't tell the difference between a switch and a pencil. And the purchasing director says, I know the difference between your problem and mine. And I think this really kind of sets the stage for the need to get alignment. When we're siloed, when we're just looking at what my goals and objectives are as the purchasing director or maybe the AP director, and not thinking about the other side of the house or the business stakeholders, then we're bound to end up with a misalignment that's going to be suboptimal. So let's talk about alignment and first look at the process. We talk about procure to pay. The purchasing process, the first P, and the second P, the payables process, are inextricably linked. There's a symbiosis here, a codependency, if you will, between the purchasing and the payables process. And looking at this model from the Hackett group, we'll start with what happens in the purchasing world. In purchasing, we're initiating requisitions, which is a demand for a product or service, taking that through an approval process, delivering an approved purchase order to the suppliers. We're involved in supplier selection and scheduling, typically on the purchasing side, also responsible not just for placing the order, but ensuring that goods and services are properly received, that they're managing content around contracts that relate to those negotiated products and services, as well as catalogs from which the end users may be shopping or selecting the required product or service that they need. So everything on the front end of the process in purchasing, of course, directly impacts what happens on the back end of the process in payables. So we look at the accounts payable responsibilities shown here in green. payables, the AP function is typically responsible for getting suppliers onboarded and maintaining and managing that supplier master of information. So if I'm in purchasing, I can't place an order effectively with a supplier if I don't have that supplier information readily and available in the supplier master, which is being managed by the accounts payable function. Of course, payables is then responsible for receiving invoices, verifying the accuracy of the invoices, going through the approval process, getting those invoices approved for payment, resolving any discrepancies that may occur, and also responding to inquiries, both by suppliers or internal stakeholders, as to the invoice and payment status. In AP, I'm responsible for maintaining this record, the archiving of filing, storing, and retrieving information, ensuring that that all those payments are compliant, they're appropriate, maintaining the accuracy of the general ledger, and including any accruals that need to be made for invoices that are on hand or goods that have been received that haven't yet been paid. So lots of activities on both sides and very much interconnected and dependent on one another. And the last step in the process, P-card management, shown in gray here, that's kind of a gray area. So can be a shared responsibility sometimes in procurement or AP in either case. But really, it really sets the stage that these processes are interconnected and codependent. So it really makes sense for both procurement and AP to get a better understanding of what goes on either upstream or downstream of them, and how they can work together more effectively with the other function to ensure that P2P is an integrated process and optimized for both. So why is this so important? Hackett did a study here where they looked at what's the relationship between top performers and as compared to average performers overall, and what is the level to which they've got clear alignment and shared accountability or responsibility across procure to pay. So in this case, it shows a pretty strong correlation that top performers, those organizations that score the best in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of the overall procure to pay process, are much more likely, so 60% of the time, they have a very strong alignment across both P's of procure to pay. So either they have a designated purchase to pay process owner who's accountable for the entire process, or they may have separate purchasing and accounts payable owners, but a tight coordination between the two. So 60% of the time, that is the case for top performing procure to pay organizations, as compared to just 44% for the average or peer group overall. So that creates a clear value to starting up front by ensuring that procurement and AP are aligned, they're on the same page, they're working together to solve procure to pay holistically, not just one P or the other. So second step here, now let's define what are our prioritized goals and objectives, and what are the success metrics going to be for procure to pay process. So one of the easiest things I think both procurement and AP groups would agree on is that we want to get rid of paper. Paper is the common enemy of everyone. So in this case, the Dilbert looks at the problem with paper and talk about the off-site document storage costs are growing out of control. At this rate, our core business can be summarized as put trees in jail. And this is where you say something wise and helpful. Trees are jerks. So as I said, we can all agree that paper is a common enemy. But going from a paper-based to a paperless process is really only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what are the overall goals and objectives for procure to pay automation. So they're numerous, and it really comes down to identifying which ones are the highest priority for your organization. So it may be, we know that a paper-bound process is introducing a number of inefficiencies. We want to achieve a much more efficient process that removes more of that transactional activity around managing paper with a fully digitized process. How can we get more strategic, as an example? Or a big driver may be, we just don't have visibility and transparency in the process, so we can't ensure process compliance, and we're especially at a disadvantage when it comes to being able to produce an audit trail for external auditors or regulators or even internal auditors for that measure. So it may be more around the governance, risk, and compliance aspect, or it may be working capital management. How do I either maximize early pay discounts and drive cost savings to the bottom line through that particular focus, or I want to extend days payable outstanding to be able to hold on to cash longer and increase our working capital. And a number of other objectives that may come into play, being able to enforce budget control on expenditures before they happen, meaning making sure that before a PO gets placed or an order gets placed with a supplier, that it's an approved expenditure on budget that's properly adjudicated and approved for payment. Or I want to just get better analytics on the back end. I want to make sure that every invoice that gets paid is properly coded and classified so that I can go back and do some strategic analysis on my expenditures, maybe do a better job of strategic sourcing or supplier selection based on the data that a more efficient and more automated P2P process can derive. So this is really about setting those goals and objectives, defining the key success metrics that resonate for your business, and being able to really focus on those in the P2P automation stage. So the third step, as I said before, it's really important before embarking on any automation project, whether that's AP automation, full P2P automation, or maybe even broader across source to pay, is really understand where you are today. What does your current process look like? And be able to benchmark that current state against the market overall. How do I compare to best in class, or just am I more in line with sort of an average performer? So in terms of examining the current process, here's another one that Dilbert gives us that looks at invoice approvals and talks about the fact that in this case, I'm embarrassed to work at my company. We can't even pay a simple invoice in less than 6 months. So what does that process look like? First, the invoice goes to our mailroom for aging. Months later, it gets to our department secretary, who says, well, if it's urgent, I'll start ignoring it immediately. And eventually it goes to the boss, who demonstrates inability to grasp the concept of time. So the order's already been placed, but the boss says, let's go get some more bids. Well, that was the past, this is the present. And if it makes it to the accounts payable group, it will be eaten by trolls. So not the ideal process, not the one you'd want to represent for your business. So, but sometimes it does involve, taking a look in the mirror and saying, what is reality in our current process, and where are the gaps that exist that we really need to address? So to help in that regard, I thought we'd do a little bit of benchmarking, and today let's play P2P Benchmark Jeopardy. So following the Jeopardy format, I've got a number of categories for you here today: transactions, spend, savings, cycle time, automation, and supplier. So all of these categories really touch what some of those key drivers and metrics are across P2P. And we won't have time to play the entire Jeopardy round here, but let's focus on those that are more on the AP side, the second P of P2P, if you will. So if I'm looking at transactions for 300, it would be very helpful to know, what is your current cost per invoice? So are you more like the average company where the cost per invoice when I take all of the fully loaded compensation and benefits for my AP function and any overhead and costs for AP, and as well as any system costs that I have, and I spread those over, or divide the total cost by the number of invoices that I process. The average organization spends about $5 per invoice. But best-in-class organizations, which have significantly automated this process, so turned a paper-based, invoice receipt and approval process into a fully automated one, have cut the cost by more than half. It costs nearly twice as much for the average performer at about $5 as compared to a best-in-class organization at about $2.25 per invoice. Sticking in the transactions category again with an AP focus, another measure I can look at is really productivity based. And so transactions for 500 would show me what is the ratio of invoices per AP FTE in an average organization as compared to best in class. So in this case, the discrepancy is even more dramatic. So best in class organizations, are able to process more than 3 times as many invoices per FTE as the average organization. And again, the biggest differentiator here is going to be the level of automation. So in both cases, processes are fairly similar. I'll assume good people are in organizations, an AP staff for both the average performer and best in class, but the best in class have the advantage of automation, which introduces an order of magnitude improvement in productivity when I get to 14,000 invoices per FTE on an annual basis as compared to less than 4,000 for the average performer. So continuing on, I'll go into the spend category for 300. Spend with line item visibility. So this is being able to ensure that an invoice which gets paid has line level, is accurately coded and classified, so that I've got on the back end visibility to exactly what was purchased from which supplier, so that I can really make strategic decisions from that. Now looking at savings, let's take savings for 500. The one that impacts the AP function specifically is the ability to capture early pay discounts. So here this benchmark is expressed as a percentage of total spend. So average performing organizations capture about 0.02% of spend in the form of early pay discounts. So a small fraction, of course, and even the best in class are capturing 0.1% of spend as early pay discounts. But that when you look at 0.1% of spend, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in many cases for large enterprises, this represents the opportunity for AP in particular to, by achieving a best-in-class type performance here, really drive bottom line savings from the AP function by being able to speed up the overall invoice receipt and approval cycle, meaning I can now maximize early pay discounts. So oftentimes the standard terms may be a 2% early pay discount in 10 days and net 30, for example. Well, if my invoice receipt and approval process takes 15, 30, 45 days or more, obviously I'm outside of the lead time to capture those early pay discounts. So an AP automation as part of an overall P2P program can really drive significant bottom line benefits from the AP function to the business overall. So let's look at cycle time. Again, with a focus on AP, cycle time for 200 tells me that the average invoice approval cycle is about 6 days. Best in class has cut that in half, so just 3 days. Another key measure that impacts accounts payable directly is days payable outstanding. So in this case, I'm not interested in accelerating the invoice payment process to capture early pay discounts. Instead, I want to lag on payables. I want to maximize my working capital by extending days payable outstanding from an average performance of just over 30 days to nearly 50 days for best in class. Now, the other key metric that most AP groups are measured on is on-time payments. Here again, the discrepancy is not as great, but still best-in-class organizations are much more likely, 91% of the time, to be able to ensure that they pay invoices according to terms on time as compared to just 83% for the average. So just hitting on my final couple of categories here. First, automation, so key to this entire value proposition around creating this linkage and creating an online match of the purchasing to the payables process. A number of key metrics to look at when you consider AP efficiency. The first and most dramatic one is this huge discrepancy between the extent to which best-in-class organizations have adopted e-invoicing as compared to the average organization overall. So best-in-class organizations are getting 79% of their total invoices electronically, and that doesn't mean as emails with attached files that someone has to key in. That would be akin to a paper invoice. This is a truly electronic invoice that's coming from the suppliers as a digital document that doesn't require manual intervention or rekeying. So here again, if I'm a best-in-class organization, I'm getting the vast majority of invoices electronic to start with. So I'm removing all that data entry and the potential for introducing errors and inaccuracies in the process by getting 79% electronically versus just 29%, less than a third of invoices for the average organization. So that's clearly an area to focus from a process improvement standpoint. How do I get to the kind of best in class where I'm getting nearly 80% of my invoices electronically? A number of these these metrics really relate to or compound upon one another. It follows logically that if I'm getting the majority of my invoices electronically, I'm going to be able to achieve a higher first pass match rate, because it's much more likely that the invoice that I receive electronically is correct and is able to be matched on a straight-through processing basis, that first pass match, at a line level with the PO. So it's not going to require rework. So best in class get 88% of invoices that go straight through on a first pass match as compared to a little bit less than 3/4 of the time for the average organization. I'm also more likely as a best in class performer to complete this cycle with an electronic payment, meaning an ACH or an EFT payment, as compared to a paper check. So 81% of payments for best-in-class organizations are electronic versus less than 2/3 of the time, just 63% for the average performer. And the last category in our P2P benchmark jeopardy today is suppliers. As I said earlier, onboarding suppliers and maintaining the supplier master file is typically the responsibility of AP. So important to AP that, number one, if I have to maintain that supplier master file, I want to rationalize and cleanse it, first of all. Many organizations have too many suppliers to begin with, but the supplier master file is unnecessarily large because they also may have a number of duplicates in that vendor master or supplier master file, such that the average organization per $1 billion in spend has nearly 18,000 suppliers versus just not quite 7,000 suppliers for a best-in-class organization. So what does that mean? That means they've used the automation tools around supplier information management to to rationalize and cleanse their supplier master to begin with. They're more strategic about being able to funnel more of their spend to preferred suppliers only, so they're removing the fragmentation that exists. So it just stands to reason that if I have fewer suppliers to maintain in my supplier master, I'm going to do a better job of making sure that it's accurate and up to date as compared to, as in this case, I've got maybe 2.5 times as many suppliers per billion in spend if I'm the average organization as compared to best in class. Likewise, the best in class have e-enabled a greater percentage of their suppliers, so about 30% of suppliers that are enabled to receive electronic transactions, POs, and be able to flip those POs into electronic invoices back. So just wanted to highlight some of the keys. There are a number of other metrics here that speak more to the procurement side, but going through this process is really helpful to say, where am I today? Where do I need to improve, particularly if I want to target a best-in-class level of performance? So the fourth step now, I kind of understand where I am by doing this benchmarking exercise. I want to design the optimal to-be process on how I go about buying and paying for goods and services that I needed here. So in this case, we'll look at kind of redesigning a process or transforming a process, and in this case from Dilbert, we're looking at human resources, and my consultants can transform human resources. We'll start with a diagnostic review, much like the benchmarking exercise that I just went through here, and then we'll identify how we want to organize. Is it around centers of excellence, consolidated into shared services? Business units then translate operational imperatives into HR actions, and does any of that mean the same as firing idiots and cutting the budget? The consultant says, which answer gets us hired? Try yes. Yes, well, let's put a bow on it and send me the invoice. So again, maybe a cautionary tale here. A lot of people here, when you talk about transforming any process, whether it's the full P2P process or transferring accounts payable, it's really an exercise to figure out how we take out headcount. And my experience has been that really is not the case. That's the exception rather than the rule. In most cases, process redesign is about how do we do things smarter and free up the resources that we have to do less mundane, tactical, kind of transactional activities and be able to do more strategic and value-added things. So with that in mind, let's tackle this subject of designing optimal buy-pay processes. And again, reinforce, I think, first, how critical it is to have this linkage between procurement and AP. And here we'll focus on the PO process and how important that is in being able to maximize efficiencies downstream in AP by making sure we got control over the procurement process up front. So let's look at, I mentioned earlier, this benchmark around what is the first pass match rate, and the fact that top performing organizations are getting nearly 90% of invoices that flow through on a first pass match, that straight through process, versus just 74% for the peer group. And drilling down in this study that the Hackett Group's done on purchase to pay performance, what are the top reasons for first pass match failures? Well, they all relate back to a lack of rigor or control on the PO process on the front end. So when I tried to do that first pass match, whether that's a three-way match or a two-way match, I saw 67% said there were price discrepancies or quantity discrepancies, or I don't have a goods receipt note, so I can't complete the three-way match, or I don't have a PO. So those are the most common reasons for not being able to complete a straight-through match. So it really reinforces the notion that to address AP automation and transform AP processes, it's really means holistically approaching the entire P2P cycle and really, dealing with the problem at the core, and kind of a root cause analysis is done here to say, if I want to have first pass matches happen 90% of the time, as the case with best in class, I really need to make sure I've got an effective PO process on the front end. So looking at a few more of the sort of inherent AP challenges and how AP automation can address those. This is a study from PayStream Advisors that said, what are the most frequently cited challenges from an AP perspective? And 25% of the time is the fact that we have a manual process for routing invoices for approval. Well, of course, that's going to be addressed through an automated or more touchless approval workflow process. Some of the other deficiencies most commonly cited was that I have actually a manual data entry and an inefficient process for, keying invoices in the first place, and the fact that most of those invoices are received in a paper format such that they require manual data entry. Well, obviously, if I'm able to achieve something like what the best-in-class organizations are doing today, getting nearly 80% of invoices electronically, then I'm only having to deal with the 20%, the minority of invoices that I have to do manual data entry on. That clearly changes the equation significantly by introducing electronic invoicing into the process. Another common complaint is I simply can't find that invoices are lost or missing. Well, by starting with the digital invoice, it's logged in the system, it's archived from the very beginning. So you're going to eliminate that problem of not being able to locate the invoice because I've got that transparency and visibility by archiving and digitizing all of the images instead of floundering around with a paper invoice and I can't find whose desk it's sitting on, for example. And some of the other complaints here, lack of visibility into what are my outstanding liabilities. So what is the in-process, commitments that we've made so we can understand and perhaps accrue as needed at a month or quarter close for outstanding liabilities. I don't have a centralized process for invoice receiving, so again, I don't have visibility to what's in flight. Or I've got an excessive number of discrepancies and exceptions, and certainly if my invoice approval and payment cycles are, are in sort of extended over where I'd like them to be, they're not as efficient as possible, then I'm not able to capture early pay discounts effectively. So really, all of these kind of challenges with an automated invoice matching process with full invoice status and visibility is going to allow full transparency. It's going to shrink the cycle time such that I can more effectively address and take advantage of early pay discounts as well. So let's talk about what are some of the optimal ways to design the BiPay process. So here's, again, a model from Hackett Group that looks at the fact that best-in-class performers are more likely to be able to design an optimal BiPay process. And it may surprise some people to know that they don't consider the three-way match as one of those most optimal ways. So in this model, multiple swim lanes here, there's a three-way match, assumed receipt, ERS, which is evaluated receipt settlement, or recurring invoices, P-card payments, travel and expense card, or invoice only. The swim lanes on the top and the bottom are considered non-optimal. The three-way match, which is still the most prevalent and most popular, not being necessarily the most optimal because it's the most labor intensive and time consuming. So certainly for the Hackett Group or no one else for that matter is saying a three-way match is still the most appropriate method, especially for larger dollar purchases, that it's not going to fall out of favor. But for some types of purchases, particularly low dollar transactions, there may be other ways that balance the need for control with a more efficient approach as well. So in some cases, it's a two-way match that may be the most optimal approach here. For instance, let's say low dollar value purchases like office supplies. Well, if I have a PO and a goods receipt, do I necessarily need an invoice? Or perhaps it's assumed receipt where I have the PO and the invoice, but for a transaction like an office supplies, I don't necessarily need the added control of having someone receive, $20 worth of pens, for example. So this really just says that when you go about redesigning your processes for simplicity, to balance control and efficiencies effectively, identify where a three-way match is mandated, but in some cases it may not be warranted, and find a more efficient way to go about it. Now, if I want to do that, I have to make sure that I can put in place the business rules that determine for which type of invoices at what expenditure thresholds, for example, do I want to go through a full three-way match versus assumed receipt or evaluated receipts as an example. So kind of talk about a best practice here, and one of the reasons for being able to automate processes and automate approval workflows as an example is, with a configurable workflow process such as shown here with the Zycus tool, I can go through a drag and drop configuration. So I can identify the business rules. Perhaps it's based on the category of purchase. So a consumable like an office supply versus a capital purchase as an example. Or at different dollar thresholds where I can say for that set of conditions I want either the three-way match or a two-way match, and have the system automatically invoke the required approval workflow process and give me visibility in real time with a graphical view of what is that approval workflow, what is the current status of that invoice approval or requisition approval process as it goes through that workflow. The other best practice is be able to really drive a guided buying approach to make sure that before that invoice shows up in accounts payable, that the requisitioner has placed their requisition and resulting PO with preferred vendor following the proper approval process, that those orders and invoices are properly coded and classified. So it's following this guided buying approach. And here again, the top performing organizations are much more likely, 3 times as likely, to be very effective in being able to drive their users to the preferred BiPay channel. So what are the best practices that account for this huge disparity between the effectiveness of best-in-class organizations at being able to implement and enforce a guided buying approach as compared to the average organization overall. So let's talk for a second about guided buying, and this is really to give an appreciation, for let's say folks in accounts payable as to what needs to happen in procurement to make the entire process more efficient. So with guided buying, we're actually using artificial intelligence to steer the users when they say I need a product or service, in this case I need a screwdriver, to what is first the right category, and users don't need to think about what is the proper commodity or category name. The artificial intelligence is going to drive them to the right category, and more importantly is going to identify for them, here are the approved vendors that you should be buying from for this. So in this case, we've got 2 approved contracted vendors, and the artificial intelligence from a guided buying approach then is going to say, okay, now you've selected the product that you need from a contracted approved vendor at negotiated pricing. And the system is going to invoke the category-specific workflow that's required to get your requisition approved and turned into a purchase order, and is also going to default for you all of the accounting information that's so critical on the back end in accounts payable. So rather than the user guessing at what the right category or GL code is for their transaction, using artificial intelligence as part of a guided buying approach, the system is going to put on the PO the correct line item level GL coding and categorization. So that means, as everyone in AP knows, if I've got an invoice that comes in and I do the matching, I've got the proper coding up front on the PO, it's going to be much easier for me to ensure that when I post that invoice and pull the information over from the PO line, that I've got the right GL coding and categorization, that I've got an accurate, compliant transaction when the invoice is actually posted for payment. So that's how that works from a guided buying approach. The other best practice that's implemented is to maximize the use of electronic catalogs wherever possible, and top performers have done that. They're getting nearly half of their transactions going through on electronic catalogs, but actually only about 15% of spend on electronic catalogs. And so what are the best practices that can ensure compliance on both non-catalog as well as catalog-based requisitions? So here the best practice for non-catalog requisitions is to be able to present that requisition, or when I've got, what is a non-catalogable item? It's probably something other than a standard commodity product like office supplies or IT goods. It's more likely to be services or non-standard or configured products. And in this case, the best practice is to present a user with a library of guided forms specific to that particular category. So if it's temporary labor, I'm going to prompt the user at the requisition stage with what are the required attributes and specifications for temporary labor, who are the preferred contracted vendors that you should be using, again, to help ensure that a compliant purchase is made. And in this case, I don't have a catalog, but I do have a contract. So it's really important to create this integration, this linkage between the P2P process and contracts overall. So when I'm creating a requisition, I can look at, for a non-catalog purchase, what are the contracted pricing and terms. When I'm processing the PO, I want to make sure that that PO references the relevant contract. And when I'm processing the invoice, having that linkage between the PO and the contract is certainly going to help me validate and verify the invoice. And even in the case of a no PO invoice, having the linkage back to the contract will help me in resolving that non-PO invoice, because I don't have a PO, but I can go to the contract to see who is the contracted vendor, what's the supplier information, what is the negotiated pricing and terms to pay that invoice appropriately. So every organization in transforming procure-to-pay process wants to digitize, wants to get to, or as close as possible to, a fully automated, paperless and touchless process as possible. So here we'll compare, this is again the Hackett Group's model, top performers to peer group overall, looking at the entire process flow, requisition to PO, PO change or blanket PO, through to invoice receipt and payment. And some of the most critical areas, certainly starting with the PO. Top performers get 85% of POs that are generated electronically, which then in turn means they're able to capture a much higher percentage of invoices electronically, because having electronic PO means that that supplier can flip that PO into an e-invoice directly back to me. So if I send the supplier an electronic PO, I am much more likely to be able to capture in return an electronic invoice. If I get 85% electronic POs, as a top performer, I'm getting 79% invoices electronically. I'm completing 81% of my payments electronically as well. Contrast that with the average performer. I'm issuing just 33% of orders electronically, and I'm therefore capturing even fewer, just 28% of invoices electronically and only 63% of payments. So I wanted to share a case study that really looks at the benefits of a holistic approach to P2P. This is a private insurance company that really had nothing in the way of automation, either on the procurement side or the AP side. So really a paper-bound process, no single version of truth when it comes to orders, payments, supplier information, and no standard or automated approval workflow process. So in this case, working together, both P2P and AP, took a holistic approach, deployed an integrated procure-to-pay and supplier management tool, and really focused on supplier enablement, communicated a strong message that supplier participation would be mandatory, but they didn't try to boil the ocean. They focused and prioritized the top 500 suppliers, or those 20% that accounted for 80% of the volume. And in doing so, they achieved, a high level of automation. So 20% of those suppliers were enabled through a standard protocol such as CXML, but 80% just coming through a portal. So all they needed was browser access to the portal to be able to receive and confirm a PO electronically, to be able to flip that PO into an invoice as well. So some of the results are pretty staggering here. First of all, much higher level of control. This insurance company was able to implement, in fact, a no PO, no pay policy, and as I've already demonstrated, so critical from a downstream AP standpoint to be able to maximize first pass match and invoice accuracy, to have the control of a PO on the front end. And it's really borne out when you look at some of the results here. So from a vendor management standpoint, by being able to offload more of that activity to the suppliers who can self-register, can check on their own invoice status on a self-service basis, the level of effort required from a vendor management standpoint was, the FTE support was reduced by 87%. The invoice automated invoice matching that was automated for a three-way match reduced 40% of the time spent by AP on those more tactical tasks of, invoice processing and exception management. They dramatically reduced the rec to PO and invoice approval cycles. So rec to PO went from 7 days to just a few hours, 1/3 of the time overall reduced on invoice approval cycles, enabling them to capture 1% of savings for prompt pay discounts on 1/3 of the total spend. So if I'm able to get a 1% early pay discount on 1/3 of my total spend, that's real dollars. Not to mention they netted $100,000 just by reducing, or in fact eliminating, duplicate payments alone. So having a more compliant process with full visibility, getting rid of duplicate payments also drove savings to the bottom line. So the last one that I'll share with you here, the 5th step, if I'm going to embark on this transformation process, ultimately I'm going to need a business case, an ROI justification to get the project approved. So here Dilbert gives us an example of a business case. Who needs to sign my business case to buy a web server? Well, this crosses all departments. I fear IT. Get the approval of every director, every VP, every EVP, plus Griffin. And do you mean Ted Griffin in finance, or the mythical Griffin beast that's half eagle, half lion, and the boss says whichever is harder? Well, this ROI business case doesn't have to be an excruciating process, but you need to have, your ducks in a row and a strong argument for why you want to do this. And here's just an example of developing a business case for P2P. And just assuming that we can go from sort of an average level to best in class, you know, the typical savings are going to be somewhere between 2 to 3% of the spend. So a dramatic number when you consider, you know, 100 million or more in spend. Let's say 100 million in this case is going to produce nearly 3 million in savings, and that's going to come through increased contract compliance, through more efficiencies gained in both the PO and invoice processes, as well as maximizing early pay discounts. So some version of this would create, for most organizations, a very compelling ROI justification for doing this. So I've taken you through some of the critical linkages between AP and procurement, taken you through the 5 steps of going about creating a world-class P2P type environment, and probably have a couple minutes left for some questions as well, Sanjivani.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was a great presentation. We do have a few questions. The first one reads, what are a few objections that may come up when we try to increase the AP procurement collaboration that we spoke about?
Yeah, well, you know, the most common objection is that when AP and procurement are operating in silos, so I'm reporting through a different process. So maybe procurement reports into operations and AP reports into finance. So we've got 2 different, you know, executives, you know, how do we get on the same page? So it's not impossible, certainly easier if, let's say, both procurement and AP report into finance. Well, ultimately, that you both roll up to the CFO, so it's easier to mandate that that they're going to work together because they're part of the same organization. But I think just going through kind of some of the steps we've talked about today, really understanding what the process is, understand where those dependencies are, and how interconnected procurement and AP are, in fact, even if the reporting relationships are through separate organizations, you ought to be able to identify how dependent one is on the other, how you know, both AP and procurement benefit when we're taking an integrated and holistic approach. And certainly, you know, the last step we just covered, spelling it out in dollars and cents of creating a business case for why we need to collaborate ought to help you know, create those linkages, even if they don't already exist from an organizational standpoint.
Sure. So the second question reads, could you define a few process improvement timelines as to when we'll be able to see the benefits of this change in approach?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of this. You know, we talked about the business case and somewhere perhaps between 2 and 3% of spend that's on the table that can be realized in the form of an ROI. But so a very significant material amount of benefit on the table, but it doesn't take years to get after. We're talking about, you know, solutions, certainly in this case with the Zycus solution, all delivered through the cloud, so it can get implemented very quickly with probably not zero, but minimal IT involvement necessary. So you're not, you know, you're not installing software. You can get implemented through a cloud-based approach very quickly in a matter of typically 90 days to get through a first phase of an implementation and start getting a rapid payback. So certainly achieving break even and payback and the return on investment within a matter of months and not years for this approach. So it's a very rapid approach. The other best practice that we talked about is prioritizing, you know, from a supplier enablement approach, going after the 20% of suppliers that generate 80% of the transaction volume. By prioritizing that in the first phase, you're guaranteeing the ability to, or certainly dramatically increasing the likelihood that you're going to get those benefits very quickly in your implementation and rollout.
Thank you, Richard. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our participants for joining this webinar, and I'd like to thank Richard for delivering a great webinar. We'll take all the other questions through email. Hope you guys have a really nice day. Thank you so much.